In August 2024, the Kamala Harris campaign was sitting on a historic, totally unprecedented $500 million war chest.
Right.
I mean, that is $540 million in cash, backed by the full institutional power of the incumbency. And yet, just, 3 months later, they lost the popular vote by millions.
Millions of votes.
They
Yeah.
just watched their entire coalition evaporate overnight.
Yeah.
So how does a political machine with virtually infinite resources and, like, every systemic advantage completely collapse on the national stage?
Well, it really defies conventional political gravity because, when you have that kind of financial dominance, the traditional models suggest you can essentially buy the margins you need, right? Like in swing states.
Exactly.
You can blanket the airwaves, you can out-organize your opponent on the ground and just completely dictate the narrative.
But the narrative slipped entirely out of their control, which basically means the traditional models are broken. So today we are looking at a brutal, highly detailed political autopsy. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to conduct a post-mortem, an after-action report on exactly why the Democratic Party lost the 2024 election.
And, for you listening, our methodology for this specific analysis relies entirely on a chronological timeline of material. It's all written by William Sanchez on his blog, Philosophical Rebellion.
Yeah.
We are tracing his real-time documentation of the campaign's structural failures, stretching, all the way back to the summer of 2023.
Yeah, but before we take a single step into this timeline, we need to establish a very clear framework for you. Because, well, the sources we are unpacking today contain highly charged, deeply polarizing political content.
Very much so.
Content that spans both intense left-wing and right-wing perspectives. So we want to make it unequivocally clear that we are taking absolutely no sides in this discussion.
Yeah, that is a crucial foundation for this deep dive. We are not endorsing William Sanchez's viewpoints.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing or condemning any of the politicians, the political parties, or, the activist movements mentioned in his writing. Our role is strictly analytical.
We're just the guides here.
Right. We are acting as impartial guides to convey the arguments, the underlying logic, and the ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material. The goal is just to help you understand the architecture of this specific critique, not to persuade you of its ultimate truth.
We are just mapping the territory.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this. The timeline starts more than a year before the general election.
Way back.
Yeah, we are looking at June 13th, 2023. Joe Biden is the incumbent president. And Sanchez publishes a post titled, Why Biden Should Participate in a Democratic Primary.
Right.
The core argument here is that the Democratic National Committee made a fatal structural error by shutting down the primary process.
And the context here is vital. At that time, an ABC poll showed that I think it was 62% of Americans already severely doubted Biden's mental and physical capacity to serve a second term.
62%.
Yeah. We are talking about an 80-year-old incumbent.
And the administration's strategy was essentially to dismiss those concerns as, like, right-wing media fabrication. They pointed to his legislative record and basically demanded voters ignore their own eyes when it came to his physical frailty.
Which is exactly why Sanchez argued a primary was mandatory, not optional.
Right.
He didn't just view a primary as a formality,
Yeah.
He viewed it as a proving ground. If the public has deep, verifiable anxiety about your cognitive fitness, you cannot alleviate that anxiety through press releases.
Or, like, heavily edited social media clips.
Exactly. You have to prove it in an unscripted, hostile environment. You have to get on a debate stage with challengers who are actively trying to take your job.
Right, because the mechanism of a primary is essentially stress testing the candidate. It's like a software company refusing to beta test a new app because they are terrified of finding bugs.
That's a great way to put it.
Right, because if you skip the beta test and just launch the app to the entire public, the moment it hits real-world traffic, it crashes. Primaries are the beta test.
That is the perfect mechanical analogy. But instead of running the beta test, the Democratic National Committee intentionally hard-coded the system to prevent any testing at all.
Wow.
Yeah, you had challengers like Marianne Williamson, who was polling around 8%, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was polling around 20% in some early Democratic polls.
Which is nothing.
Not at all. But the DNC executive director, Sam Cornell, explicitly stated, "We're with Biden, period." The DNC actually passed a unanimous resolution in early 2023 expressing full support for a second term.
They just froze the whole process.
Froze it completely.
I mean, I understand the critique, but let's examine the traditional political physics for a second here. Historically, An incumbent president avoids primary challenges specifically to project institutional strength, right?
Sure, yeah.
Like if you are fighting a brutal internal war a year before the general election, you risk fracturing your own coalition. And you give the opposing party endless opposition research. So wasn't the DNC simply operating the levers of power the way, I don't know, every incumbent party has for a century?
Well, under normal atmospheric conditions, yes. But Sanchez's thesis is that 2024 was operating under entirely unprecedented conditions due to the visibly accelerating decline of the candidate.
Right, the H factor.
Exactly. When the elector is actively wondering if the commander-in-chief can finish a thought or, navigate a staircase, using institutional power to hide him doesn't project strength.
It projects a cover-up.
Exactly. It validates the exact fears the voters already hold.
And beyond just testing the candidate's fitness, there is the ideological cost of canceling a primary. Like, look at what happened in 2020. That primary was an absolute ideological crucible.
Oh, absolutely.
There were almost 30 candidates and 11 separate debates.
The mechanics of a crowded primary are fascinating because of how they force innovation. When you have 30 people on a stage, a generic platform of, I'm a good Democrat, just doesn't get you any media oxygen.
No, you just fade into the background.
Right. Candidates are forced to develop highly specific, aggressively differentiated policy mechanisms just to stand out.
Which is how you get Elizabeth Warren rolling out highly technical blueprints for universal childcare funded by a wealth tax. Or, Bernie Sanders moving Medicare for all from a fringe socialist talking point into the mainstream center of the debate.
Yeah, that pressure cooker generated the robust policy platform that Biden ultimately used to win the 2020 election.
And furthermore, it builds the party's future infrastructure. Like, a primary allows unknown figures to introduce themselves to the national electorate.
That's such an important point.
Look at 2020. Pete Buttigieg was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which is a city of barely 100,000 people.
Right.
The primary mechanism allowed him to rise from total obscurity to a household name. But by freezing the 2024 primary, Sanchez argues the DNC didn't just protect Biden, they suffocated policy innovation and starved the next generation of leadership of the oxygen they needed to grow.
And because the DNC silenced that primary process, all of that ideological tension had nowhere to go. It was just bottled up within the base.
And you can only cap a pressure cooker for so long before a spark sets it off.
Exactly. The frustration didn't vanish. It just waited for a catalyst. Which brings us to the spring of 2024. The geopolitical landscape shifts violently and that bottled up energy explodes.
Okay, so we are looking at a pair of posts from April and May of 2024.
Yeah. They're titled Campus Crackdown and Campus Protests, the Uncommitted Vote, and the Leahy Laws.
This is the moment the internal fractures within the Democratic coalition stop being theoretical and become actively destructive.
Yeah.
Like, Sanchez documents the intense wave of campus protests sweeping across American universities in response to the Israeli military's actions in Gaza.
And he focuses heavily on the reaction of the political establishment to these protests. Instead of engaging with the underlying grievances of these young voters, the establishment, which Sanchez notes is heavily intertwined with the Israel lobby, attempted to utilize legal and institutional force to restrict the free speech of the demonstrators.
Restricting the protests themselves.
Right. There was a concerted push to expand the legal definition of anti-Semitism to encompass almost any severe criticism of the Israeli state, effectively weaponizing the law against American citizens protesting foreign policy.
But to really understand the absolute breaking point here, we have to look at the specific legal mechanism Sanchez anchors his argument to, which is the Leahy Laws.
Yeah, the Leahy Laws, they are essentially a human rights circuit breaker built directly into United States foreign assistance policy.
Okay, break that down for us.
Mechanically, these laws explicitly prohibit the U.S. government from providing any military funding, weapons, or training to foreign security force units that are credibly implicated in gross violations of human rights.
So if a foreign military unit commits a war crime, the American funding pipe is supposed to automatically shut off.
Precisely. It is not a suggestion, it is a statutory requirement. And Sanchez points to the catastrophic conditions on the ground in Gaza to argue that this circuit breaker should have been tripped months prior. He highlights data from the World Food Program and the United Nations confirming a full-blown man-made famine.
Yeah, he brings in quotes from Cindy McCain, the director of the World Food Program, describing the physiological reality of children literally wasting away into skeletons due to prolonged systemic deprivation of calories.
It's brutal.
It is. Sanchez's argument is that the Israeli government was systematically and deliberately utilizing starvation as a weapon of war against a civilian population.
And he backs this up with the stated intentions of Israeli leadership. He cites Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's October 2023 announcement of a, quote, complete siege, explicitly cutting off food, water, electricity, and fuel.
Right.
He cites Prime Minister Netanyahu stating they would only permit the absolute minimal humanitarian aid necessary to prevent a total collapse that might interfere with their military objectives.
So through the lens of the Leahy laws,
Yeah.
Sanchez views these actions as glaring, indisputable violations. Yet the Biden administration bypassed the circuit breaker entirely.
They absolutely did.
They utilized emergency declarations and bureaucratic loopholes to continue supplying billions of dollars in offensive weaponry, including, heavy munitions and fighter jets, while the civilian population starved.
And the psychological and moral damage this inflicted on the Democratic base just cannot be overstated. I mean, you have a political party that has spent decades branding itself as the global champion of human rights, international law, and the protection of vulnerable minorities.
Right. It's like trying to keep a coalition tent standing while actively setting fire to the stakes holding it down.
Exactly. And suddenly the youth vote, the progressive wing, and Arab American communities perceive that same party as actively funding, arming, and providing diplomatic cover for historic atrocities.
Yeah.
That isn't just a disagreement over a marginal tax rate. That is a foundational moral rupture.
And Sanchez points to the uncommitted movement as the ultimate warning siren that the establishment just chose to ignore. During the Michigan Democratic primary, over 100,000 voters cast their ballots for uncommitted rather than checking the box for Joe Biden.
Let's talk about the mechanics of a protest vote like that for a second.
Please do.
Because 100,000 people didn't just stay home on their couches and complain on social media. They actively took time out of their day, drove to a polling location, stood in line, and deliberately voted for nobody.
Right. That requires a massive amount of activation energy.
Exactly. It is a highly sophisticated way of sending a data point directly into the campaign's internal modeling software, basically screaming, "We are the margin of victory and we were leaving."
And Sanchez's devastating conclusion is that the Biden administration looked at those 100,000 lost votes in one of the most critical swing states in the Electoral College, analyzed the data, and essentially decided they did not care.
They calculated that they could absorb the loss of that coalition and still win.
So the base is fiscally fracturing over human rights and foreign policy. The youth vote is aggressively abandoning the party. And while all of this internal hemorrhaging is happening, the general electorate is about to witness the exact nightmare scenario regarding cognitive fitness that Sanchez had warned about a year earlier.
Yeah, the pressure valve finally bursts on the national debate stage.
We are looking at July 2024 now. Sanchez writes a post on July 6th titled simply, "Drop Out Joe."
The June debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump was a catastrophic event for the Democratic Party. For an entire year, the administration's communications team had utilized every tool at their disposal to gaslight the public.
Insisting that behind closed doors, Biden was sharp, focused, and completely in command of his faculties.
Exactly. But on live television, with tens of millions of people watching, the reality was impossible to hide. The mechanics of a debate require rapid recall, aggressive pivoting, and rhetorical stamina.
And Biden lacked all three.
He routinely lost his train of thought mid-sentence. He stared blankly. He failed to counter Trump's attacks and, in some instances, articulated completely incoherent policy positions. The illusion just evaporated in 90 minutes.
In the immediate aftermath, Sanchez forcefully demands that Biden step down. But he goes much further than simply demanding a resignation, right?
Well, yeah.
He proposes a highly specific, fundamentally disruptive ticket to replace him. He suggests elevating Bernie Sanders to the top of the ticket while retaining Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee.
Which is a fascinating pivot.
I have to pause here, though, because the immediate counterargument is blindingly obvious to anyone paying attention. Bernie Sanders, in 2024, was older than Joe Biden.
Right, he was.
If the entire crisis is predicated on the public's fear of an octogenarian president, how does replacing him with an even older candidate solve the structural problem?
It is a critical distinction, and Sanchez addresses it by separating chronological age from cognitive fitness. While Sanders is chronologically older, Sanchez argues his neurological stamina was demonstrably intact.
Okay.
He points to the mechanical realities of Sanders' daily schedule, like frequently delivering 40-minute unscripted policy speeches, actively commanding complex Senate committee hearings, aggressively subpoenaing pharmaceutical CEOs, and verbally sparring with union-busting corporate executives on the Senate floor.
So age is a number, but cognitive decline is a pathology. Biden was suffering from the latter. Sanders was merely experiencing the former.
Right.
But there's a strategic layer to this Sanders proposal as well, having to do with Donald Trump's specific political gravity.
What's fascinating here is how Trump's enduring political superpower is his ability to occupy the anti-corruption outsider lane.
Oh, absolutely.
He successfully brands himself as the sledgehammer coming to destroy a rigged Washington consensus. For a conventional establishment Democrat, countering that is incredibly difficult because they are the embodiment of that consensus.
But Sanchez argues that a Bernie Sanders candidacy completely neutralizes Trump's primary weapon. For Trump, fighting the elites is largely rhetorical branding. But for Sanders, fighting the oligarchy, challenging corporate monopolies, and dismantling corrupt campaign finance structures is his authentic, lifelong ideological framework.
Exactly. Sanders could walk onto a debate stage and credibly outflank Trump on economic populism.
However, as the historical record shows, the Democratic establishment did not choose the path of economic populism. On July 21st, bowing to insurmountable pressure from donors and party elites, Joe Biden officially ended his re-election campaign.
And within hours, literally before the news cycle had even processed the resignation, the DNC completely bypassed any concept of an open primary or a competitive convention. They instantly coronated Vice President Kamala Harris as the presumptive nominee.
This action is analyzed in Sanchez's July 22nd post, titled Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton 2.0. Here, Sanchez launches a profound critique of the mechanics of entitlement campaigns.
The core idea here is the difference between inheriting power and earning it.
Yes. Sanchez fully acknowledges that as vice president, Harris was the constitutional and institutional successor. But he argues that institutional succession does not equal electoral viability.
Right, you still have to win the votes.
Exactly. He pulls the receipts from her actual performance when she was forced to compete for votes during the 2020 Democratic primary.
And the mechanics of her 2020 collapse are highly revealing. I mean, she launched her campaign to massive media fanfare, peaked early at around 15% in national polls, and then suffered a catastrophic deflation.
She actually suspended her campaign in December of 2019, right?
Yes.
Before a single primary vote was cast.
Yes.
And critically, before voting reached her home state of California.
She dropped out early because internal polling indicated she was on track to suffer a humiliating fifth-place finish in her own state.
Wow.
Sanchez cites exhaustive reporting from the New York Times at the time, which featured dozens of her own staffers detailing a campaign paralyzed by deep structural dysfunction, a lack of clear ideological vision, and an inability to articulate a core message beyond simply wanting to be president.
Furthermore, her historical record as a tough-on-crime prosecutor deeply alienated the very progressive base the party desperately needed to activate. So when the DNC elites and billionaire donors instantly coalesce around her in 2024, Sanchez predicts absolute electoral disaster.
He views it as a direct replication of the 2016 strategy that cleared the field for Hillary Clinton.
The structural flaw of an entitlement campaign is that it relies almost entirely on negative polarization.
Right.
Because the candidate hasn't survived a primary process to forge a positive, mandated policy vision, the campaign's entire architecture rests on the premise of the other guy is an existential threat.
And while Trump is an existential threat might be true, it is not a vision, it is a defense mechanism.
Right.
Sanchez argues they desperately needed a highly compressed, aggressively competitive mini primary leading into the August convention.
Imagine the mechanics of that. I mean, what would that even look like? 3 or 4 nationally televised town halls or debates in a matter of weeks. The candidates would be forced to rapidly assemble teams, articulate visions under extreme pressure, and answer unscripted questions from voters.
It would have been intense.
But if you play devil's advocate here, wouldn't a mini primary just as likely descend into a chaotic, circular firing squad? You could have factions of the party tearing each other apart on national television right before a general election.
The establishment certainly feared that chaos. But Sanchez argues that avoiding chaos by skipping democracy is a paradox that guarantees failure.
Okay, how so?
Well, if a candidate cannot survive a few weeks of internal debate without the party collapsing, they have zero chance of surviving the general election week grinder. Any candidate who emerged victorious from a grueling mini-primary would have stepped onto the convention stage with immense organic momentum.
They would be a battle-tested champion.
Exactly. Instead, Harris stepped onto the stage as an heir apparent appointed by insiders.
This transition from the mechanics of the coronation to the actual policy choices of the Harris campaign leads us into the most intense, severe segment of Sanchez's timeline.
Yeah, this gets heavy.
We are moving into September 2024. And this is where the analysis takes a very sharp, controversial turn, because it moves from a critique of political strategy to a devastating critique of morality and intentionality. We are looking at a post titled Kamala Harris and the Uncommitted Movement.
It is essential to clearly articulate the specific argument Sanchez constructs here because it is the ideological core of his entire postmortem.
To be absolutely explicit on what the source material states for you listening, William Sanchez argues that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris deliberately chose to sacrifice the 2024 election in order to facilitate Israel's genocide in Gaza.
He is not arguing that they made a strategic miscalculation.
No.
He is arguing they engaged in a cold, deliberate calculus. They weighed the mathematical cost of losing the progressive, youth, and Arab American vote against the political and financial cost of altering their foreign policy to constrain Israel. And they actively, knowingly chose to lose those voters, and by extension, the presidency.
Furthermore, Sanchez explicitly states that the campaign's absolute biggest, most fatal failure was their active, continuous refusal to engage with the uncommitted movement.
To understand the weight of this refusal, you have to look at the massive shifts in international law that were occurring simultaneously.
Right.
The global legal consensus was hardening. The International Court of Justice had recently issued a ruling declaring Israel's 57-year occupation of Palestinian territory to be an illegal annexation and functionally an apartheid system.
The United Nations General Assembly was passing overwhelming resolutions demanding an end to the occupation. And most critically, you had the actions of the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, the ICC's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, formally requested arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
And the specific charges listed in those warrants were devastating. We're talking extermination, murder, and the deliberate use of civilian starvation as a method of warfare.
So you have the highest international legal bodies on earth validating the exact claims the campus protesters and the uncommitted movement had been making for nearly a year.
Right.
The demands of the uncommitted movement were not radical. They were deeply rooted in existing law. They were simply asking Kamala Harris to commit to enforcing the Leahy laws, to stop sending offensive taxpayer-funded weapons to a foreign leadership facing international arrest warrants for starvation.
But Harris firmly refused to make that commitment.
Yeah.
And Sanchez argues she refused because the Democratic establishment is utterly terrified of the financial and political retributive power of the Israel lobby.
Which brings us to the mechanics of that lobby. Because it's not just about politicians liking a foreign country, it's about brutal campaign finance realities.
Sanchez points to AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. How does a lobby like that actually enforce compliance?
It functions through the overwhelming deployment of targeted capital. Sanchez cites a specific example from the 2024 primary cycle. Jamal Bowman was a progressive Democratic incumbent in New York who became a vocal critic of the war in Gaza.
Okay.
AIPAC did not simply fund his opponent. They marshaled a staggering $23 million into a single local congressional primary race.
$23 million in a House race is an unfathomable amount of money. The mechanics of that mean they can buy every available second of television airtime.
Every second.
They can flood every mailbox with high-gloss opposition research. They essentially create an alternate reality for local voters, where the incumbent's entire record is erased and replaced by a highly produced negative caricature.
And that $23 million isn't just about defeating Jamal Bowman. It is a highly visible warning shot to every other Democrat in Congress. The message is, if you deviate from our preferred foreign policy, we have the capital to end your career.
Right.
Sanchez argues the DNC elites are completely captured by this fear.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I need to push back on the financial logic here.
Okay.
Sanchez himself notes in this exact post that by August, the Kamala Harris campaign had amassed a war chest of $540 million.
They did.
They had infinite money. If you have over $500 million sitting in your campaign accounts, you don't need AIPAC's money. Why couldn't they afford to take the political hit from the lobby, embrace the uncommitted movement, secure the swing states, and just outspend any negative blowback?
It is a paradox, for sure. but it reveals the deeper rot Sanchez is diagnosing. His answer is that the capture isn't merely transactional, it is ideological.
Ah, I see.
The Democratic establishment, the billionaire donor class, and these massive lobbying organizations are fundamentally part of the same corporate ecosystem. They attend the same galas, they hire the same consultants, and they view the world through the same hegemonic lens.
So they're all in the same club.
Exactly. They are ideologically incapable of breaking with that consensus, even when the math clearly shows it will cost them the election. They would rather lose to Donald Trump than win by conceding power to the progressive anti-war left.
And so the election happens. And exactly as Sanchez predicted through this entire timeline, the structural rot gives way and the building collapses. Let's look at segment 5, the postmortem. We are in November 2024 examining posts titled Democrats Did It to Themselves and the Death of the Democratic Party.
Donald Trump has secured a second term. And to truly grasp the scale of the Democratic failure, we must look at the actual final popular vote totals.
Right. Now, Sanchez made some preliminary estimates in his immediate November 7th post before all the West Coast ballots were counted. But we are going to use the actual final certified numbers available online to illustrate the precise voter drop-off.
Good idea.
If you look at 2020, Joe Biden won the presidency with roughly 81 million votes, while Donald Trump lost with about 74 million.
But look at the final tally for 2024. Donald Trump actually increased his total, securing roughly 76.8 million votes.
Wow. Meanwhile, the Kamala Harris campaign, backed by that $500 million war chest, secured only about 74.3 million votes.
The contrast is staggering. Trump slightly expanded his base, adding a few million votes, but the Democratic coalition suffered a catastrophic implosion. Kamala Harris lost nearly 7 million voters compared to Joe Biden's performance just 4 years prior.
Almost 7 million people who were motivated enough to stand in line and vote for a Democrat in 2020 looked at the Harris campaign and said no.
Yeah, they just walked away.
They either stayed home, voted third party, or flipped to Trump. And Sanchez aggressively preempts the standard establishment excuses. He argues this massive drop-off was not caused by sudden waves of racism or misogyny or nefarious Russian election interference.
He places the blame entirely, squarely on the DNC elites. And he traces the genesis of this specific failure directly back to what he terms the Never Bernie establishment.
This is where the timeline expands dramatically, because he draws a direct, unbroken line from the internal mechanics of 2016 straight to the collapse in 2024.
Sanchez's overarching thesis is that Donald Trump's two victories in 2016 and 2024 are not anomalies. They are the direct, unavoidable result of the Democratic Party establishment rigging their own internal systems to systematically crush Bernie Sanders' brand of economic populism.
I want to understand the exact mechanics of that rigging because, people throw that word around loosely. How did DNC structurally overrule the voters? He points to a wild statistic from the 2016 New Hampshire primary.
The mechanism is called the superdelegate system. In a normal primary, delegates are pledged proportionally based on how the citizens actually vote.
Right.
Democracy.
But the DNC maintained a class of superdelegates, party insiders, lobbyists, and elected officials who could cast convention votes for whoever they wanted, regardless of the public will.
So in 2016, Bernie Sanders absolutely demolishes Hillary Clinton in the New Hampshire primary. He beats her by roughly 55,000 raw votes at the ballot box.
But because all 6 of New Hampshire's superdelegates unilaterally pledged their support to Hillary Clinton, they effectively erased the Democratic will of those 55,000 voters. That is wild.
The media reported the delegate count as a tie, completely nullifying Sanders' massive popular victory and signaling to the electorate that the party elites, not the voters, were in control.
And Sanchez claims they executed a more sophisticated version of this control in 2020. He documents how Sanders was leading the primary field heading into March. He had the momentum, the funding, and the grassroots energy. And then the billionaire-aligned centrist wing of the party coordinated a mass, unprecedented consolidation.
Within a span of 24 hours, viable candidates like Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Beto O'Rourke all miraculously suspended their campaigns and simultaneously endorsed Joe Biden.
The mechanics of that kind of coordination require immense behind-the-scenes leverage from the donor class.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't get 3 massive egos to quit a presidential race on the same afternoon unless the funding spigots are suddenly forcefully turned off and, future cabinet positions are quietly guaranteed. They consolidated the entire centrist lane into a single candidate to block Sanders from securing a plurality.
And why does this matter for 2024? Because Sanchez argues that the American electorate is fundamentally deeply angry. They possess a correct, visceral understanding that the macroeconomic system is rigged to funnel wealth upward to the ultra-rich while the working class drowns in debt.
Bernie Sanders offered a left-wing, anti-corruption, economic populist solution to that anger. He offered a mechanism to dismantle the monopolies and tax the billionaires. But because the DNC is entirely funded by those exact same billionaires, they could not allow Sanders to win.
Exactly. So they crushed the left-wing populist movement and forced highly unpopular status quo centrists like Clinton, Biden, and Harris onto the general election ballot. And by doing so, the DNC completely vacated the populist lane, allowing Donald Trump to entirely monopolize the anti-corruption system is rigged narrative.
Sanchez includes a brilliant quote from Bernie Sanders reacting to the 2024 loss. Sanders observed that the Democrats ran a campaign dedicated to protecting the status quo, offering policies that merely tinkered around the edges, while Trump successfully campaigned on smashing the existing order.
Think about the mechanics of that appeal.
Yeah.
If your house is sinking because the foundation is rotten, and a Democratic politician knocks on your door offering you a slight tax credit to patch a leak in the roof, you aren't going to be inspired.
Not at all.
But if Donald Trump knocks on your door with a sledgehammer and says, "The whole house is corrupt, let's smash it," you might just hand him the hammer, even if he has no plan to rebuild it. People wanted the sledgehammer.
Which brings Sanchez to dig even deeper into the ideological roots of this failure in Segment 6. We are looking at posts from late November and December 2024 titled, "The Unforgivable Legacy of Genocide Joe," "The Obama Era is Over," and "The Progressive Party of America."
In late November, the International Criminal Court officially issues those arrest warrants for Netanyahu. For the progressive base, this is total, undeniable vindication of everything they protested for all year.
Right.
But for the Biden-Harris legacy, it is the final nail in the coffin. They are now historically recorded as the administration that provided weapons and diplomatic cover to an indicted war criminal.
So with the 2024 legacy permanently sunk, Sanchez asks the ultimate structural question, like, where did this modern era of democratic failure actually begin? And he points the finger at an unexpected target, Barack Obama.
Sanchez digs down to the absolute bedrock of the party's ideological drift. He argues that the failures of 2016 and 2024 were born from the squandered potential of 2008.
Interesting.
Barack Obama won a historic, sweeping mandate on a revolutionary progressive platform. He promised universal health care. He promised to ban corporate lobbyists from the DNC. He promised to end unjust foreign wars.
The mechanical reality of his power in 2009 was staggering. He had 257 Democratic seats in the House. He had 59 seats in the Senate, which is a filibuster-proof supermajority for a brief period. He had the institutional power to fundamentally rewire the American social contract.
But according to Sanchez's analysis, the moment Obama achieved power, he governed as a cautious establishment centrist. Instead of utilizing his massive majorities to fight for a public universal healthcare system, he immediately compromised with corporate interests.
Right. He adopted the Affordable Care Act, which was structurally based on Romney Care, a model developed by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. The core mechanism of that law was the individual mandate, which literally forced American citizens, under threat of financial penalty, to purchase products from private, for-profit health insurance corporations.
It entrenched the corporate middlemen rather than eliminating them.
And when the 2008 financial crisis devastated the working class, instead of holding Wall Street executives legally accountable for the fraud that caused the crash, the Obama administration engineered massive bailouts for the banks, while millions of ordinary Americans lost their homes to foreclosure.
Sanchez uses a profoundly powerful historical comparison to describe this brand of establishment Democrat. He equates them to Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of the white moderate.
That is a staggering parallel to draw, and we need to understand the context of MLK's original critique. In his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King wrote that the greatest stumbling block for the civil rights movement wasn't the Ku Klux Klanner or the white citizens' counselor.
Right. The greatest stumbling block was the white moderate, who claimed to agree with the goal of equality, but constantly criticized the methods of direct action. The moderate was more devoted to order than to justice.
They preferred a negative peace, which is merely the absence of visible tension, over a positive peace, which requires the presence of actual justice.
And Sanchez directly maps that critique onto the modern DNC establishment. He argues they are the white moderates of economic inequality and human rights. They constantly claim to want a fair economy and a peaceful foreign policy, but they abhor the systemic disruption required to achieve those things.
Yeah.
They prefer the comfortable, well-funded status quo of corporate donations and polite bipartisan decorum over the necessary, uncomfortable tension of fighting billionaires and dismantling the military-industrial complex.
This deep ideological rot leads to an inevitable crisis, which Sanchez addresses in his December post regarding the upcoming February 2025 election for a new DNC chair.
This raises an important question. The party has to choose new leadership. And Sanchez posits a strict, uncompromising ultimatum. He argues that the Democratic Party must undergo an immediate, radical, structural purge. They must permanently ban all corporate PAYE money. They must reject funding from billionaire super PACs. They must completely sever ties with the consultant class and embrace a genuine, aggressive working-class populism.
And if they refuse?
Then, he argues, the progressive wing must finally permanently abandon the Democratic Party and form a viable, independent third party.
Okay, I have to step in here and challenge this logic.
Wait.
But is a third party actually mathematically viable in the United States system? Or is Sanchez letting his sheer blinding frustration override the brutal realities of the Electoral College?
It's a fair question.
Because the U.S. uses a first-past-the-post voting mechanism that mathematically punishes third parties, virtually ensuring they act only as spoilers. If progressives split off, they don't win, they just guarantee permanent, unchecked power for the far right, which is the outcome they want least.
Your critique is rooted in orthodox political science, and under normal conditions, the spoiler effect is an absolute mathematical reality. But Sanchez's counterargument is that the DNC itself is currently acting as the spoiler to progress.
Oh, wow.
He argues that by staying trapped inside a party apparatus wholly controlled by corporate interests, the progressive movement is functioning as controlled opposition. They give the illusion of left-wing representation while achieving no structural victories.
So how does he bypass the math?
By scale. He points to the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which currently contains nearly 100 members of the House of Representatives. Sanchez argues that if you have a slow trickle of defections, yes, you get a spoiler third party. But if all 100 members coordinated a mass walkout simultaneously, pulling their fundraising infrastructure and millions of voters with them, it wouldn't create a fringe third party.
It would trigger an immediate systemic collapse of the DNC.
Exactly. It would be a political earthquake that destroys the old structure to instantly replace it with a new one.
He is arguing for a hostile takeover by abandonment. They have to be willing to burn the ship to build a better one. Which brings us to the final segment of our deep dive, segment 7, the future. We are looking at Sanchez's post from late 2025 titled Harness Their Hatred and a Democratic Socialist Revolution.
Looking back with a year of hindsight, Sanchez severely criticizes the strategic absurdity of the 2024 campaign. He zeroes in on the Harris campaign's obsession with courting what he calls the mythical, enlightened centrist Liz Cheney voter.
This was a defining feature of the final weeks of the campaign. Kamala Harris actively chose to make Liz Cheney a staunchly conservative, anti-labor, pro-war Republican who celebrated the overturning of Roe v. Wade, her primary surrogate on the campaign trail.
The mechanical strategy there was an attempt to peel off affluent, suburban, moderate Republicans who were supposedly disgusted by Trump's rhetoric. But Sanchez argues that by elevating Cheney, the Democrats explicitly broadcast to the working class that the party aligned more with the architects of endless war and corporate deregulation than with the struggles of ordinary laborers.
The Democrats are fundamentally terrified of being hated by the institutional establishment.
To counter this profound cowardice, Sanchez invokes the historical posture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. During the implementation of the New Deal, FDR was actively, viciously despised by the banking class, the corporate monopolies, and the wealthy elite.
And instead of apologizing or moderating his stance, FDR leaned into that hatred. He delivered a speech at Madison Square Garden just before his 1936 reelection, where he declared that the forces of organized money were unanimous in their hate for him.
Right.
And then he delivered the defining line of American populism, and I welcome their hatred.
Sanchez argues that a legitimate working-class party must be hated. If the billionaire class, the private equity managers, and the right-wing media apparatus do not actively despise you, it means you are not threatening their power.
You are not changing the system.
Exactly. Democrats need to embrace being hated, but for the right reasons. They should be hated because they're ruthlessly clawing back wealth for the working class, not because they're hypocritical corporate centrists.
So what does that actual structural change look like? Sanchez uses his final posts to outline a vision for a democratic socialist revolution. But crucially, he doesn't frame this as a foreign, imported Marxist ideology.
He goes out of his way to root this vision deeply in the history of the American labor movement.
Exactly. He traces a direct, indigenous American lineage. He points to Abraham Lincoln's early rhetoric on the priority of labor over capital. He draws on Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism and trust busting.
Yeah, and he connects it to FDR's Economic Bill of Rights, to MLK Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign, and finally to Bernie Sanders. Sanchez insists that democratic socialism is simply the modern, aggressive manifestation of the constitutional mandate to promote the general welfare.
And he doesn't just stick to broad philosophy. He gets into some fascinating, highly disruptive policy specifics. For instance, he targets the modern housing crisis.
Yeah.
Instead of offering marginal tax credits for first-time buyers, he suggests utilizing federal law to permanently ban private equity firms, like BlackRock, from purchasing single-family homes.
The mechanism of private equity in the housing market is currently designed to artificially constrict supply, transforming neighborhoods into permanent renter-class fiefdoms to maximize shareholder yield through rent gouging.
Right.
Banning them forces millions of homes back onto the open market for actual families.
But he goes even further on supply. He proposes mobilizing the United States Army Corps of Engineers, the same federal body that built the massive dams and infrastructure projects of the New Deal, to purchase fleets of massive 3D house printing machines.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they would partner with local municipalities to mass-produce affordable housing at cost, completely bypassing the profit motives of private developers. He treats housing as a fundamental public utility, not a speculative financial asset.
He also details mechanisms for massive wealth redistribution. He proposes structural changes to corporate governance that would mandate that the laborers who physically generate the value for massive logistics networks like Amazon or Walmart must receive the lion's share of the profits.
Drastically reducing the parasitic extraction by passive shareholders and executives.
Right. It is a fundamental rewiring of the American economy.
The overarching takeaway from these late 2025 posts is how Sanchez brings his entire critique full circle. He realizes that you cannot defeat the aggressive, right-wing pseudo-populism of Donald Trump with polite corporate centrism.
The only effective antidote to right-wing populism is a robust, unapologetic left-wing populism that promises and delivers material changes to the lives of the working class.
So what does this all mean? We have just traversed a multi-year timeline of systemic political collapse documented meticulously by William Sanchez. If we synthesize the core components of his argument, the architecture of the failure is clear.
The Democratic Party lost the 2024 election because they utilized their institutional power to silence the primary process, insulating a visibly declining incumbent from necessary debate.
They chose to ignore the profound moral outrage of the uncommitted movement, legally and financially tethering themselves to the devastation in Gaza.
They clung desperately to the financial lifelines of billionaire donors and the Israel lobby, repeatedly abandoning the working class to protect their establishment relationships.
And by aggressively crushing the left-wing populist movement led by figures like Bernie Sanders, they repeated the exact same entitlement campaign mistakes of the Clinton and Obama eras, completely vacating the anti-establishment lane.
By systematically executing every one of those choices, they essentially wrapped the 2024 election in a bow and handed the keys back to Donald Trump. They chose the comfort of their donor class over the material and moral demands of their own voting base.
And that choice carries historic consequences.
It certainly does. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with a brand new thought to ponder, something that builds on the foundation of everything Sanchez wrote, but takes the structural logic one step further.
Oh, lay it on us.
Consider the fundamental mechanics of a political organization. If a party's internal financial engine, meaning its absolute reliance on billionaires, super PACs, and corporate lobbyists to fund its billion-dollar campaigns, is diametrically opposed to the economic survival needs of the working-class voters it relies on to win, can that party ever truly succeed in an era defined by populist anger?
Or are the modern Democrats destined to go the exact way of the Whig Party in the 1850s? For those who don't remember their political history, the Whig Party didn't just lose an election. They collapsed completely under the weight of their own massive internal contradictions regarding the expansion of slavery.
Disintegrating almost overnight.
Yeah, disintegrating overnight to make way for a brand new, explicitly anti-slavery party, the Republicans under Lincoln, to rise from the ashes. Are we watching a temporary electoral defeat? Or are we witnessing the terminal collapse of a party that can no longer survive its own contradictions?
The diagnostic landscape is murky, but the structural fractures are undeniable.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you're handed, and we will catch you next time.